Look at him! Somebody walk this man back to his shed before he scratches the $35 million paint with his eyes!
The crack of Grayson Pell's open hand striking Solomon's face rang out violently across the marble floor. Solomon's head snapped sideways, a sharp sting blooming hot on his cheek. But his expression stayed deathly calm. Calm as still water in the dark. Pell ripped the iron wrench out of Solomon's grip and hurled it to the ground, where it clattered and skidded across the polished stone.
Keep your filthy, grease-stained hands off a masterpiece, boy. Look at your skin. Look at that faded gray rag they call a uniform. A high society gala is no place for a black yard man who smells like river mud and poverty. You are nothing but furniture to go crawl a coast over this bong!
Adelaide Lockhart let out a harsh, mocking laugh, the diamonds at her throat catching the light of the ballroom and throwing it around the room like broken glass. The wealthy crowd erupted into savage laughter. Phones slid out of silk pockets, their little red recording lights glowing like tiny eyes gathered to watch a public execution. Adelaide turned to face her audience, and her smile sharpened into something close to pure cruelty.
You know what? Fix it, and I'll marry you!
The mocking roar rolled across the terrace and defiled the night air. They thought they were breaking a beggar. They had no idea that the faded gray uniform covered the legendary lead engine engineer of Kestrel Racing. They chose to slap his face and laugh. But 35 minutes from that moment, the dying machine at the center of the room would demand a master, and the only man alive who could unlock its frozen heart was the very man they had just tried to bury in the dark. Welcome to the silent verdict. This is the unforgettable night. They slapped and laughed at the quiet man in the dark. And the night a $35 million engine forced a room full of millionaires to finally learn his name. Stay with this story to the end, because the truth always cuts louder than the lie. Have you ever been laughed at by a room full of people who decided exactly what you were worth before you ever opened your mouth? Have you ever stood in a beautiful place, in your clean and honest uniform, and felt 300 pairs of eyes slide right over you, the way eyes slide over a coat rack, like the floor itself would have insulted them less by daring to speak? Hold on to that feeling. Sit with it, because 35 minutes before that woman threw a wedding at a black man like she was tossing a coin to a beggar in the gutter, this entire night was already a trap. And the only person in that ballroom who could spring it open was standing out in the dark, holding a ladder, listening to a dying machine through an open service door. This is the story of the night they laughed. Hartwell Hall sat on a sea island, an hour south of Charleston, where the live oaks grew so old and so wide that their branches dipped down to touch the ground and then rose up again. And the gray moss hung off them, like the long beards of patient men who had seen everything and chosen to say nothing. The estate ran for 2 miles along the salt marsh. The tidal creeks moved through the grass twice a day. Silver running out, silver running back in. And the great white house stood at the high end of the property where the land lifted just enough to keep the water honest. It was a white house with black shutters and columns 2 stories tall, and it had been built in the year 1851 by men whose names were carved into the marble of the local church, and whose other names, the names of the people who did the actual building, the lifting, the burning of the brick, were carved into nothing at all. The Lockhart family had bought the place in 1974, scrubbed the old story off it, and filled it with a new one made of shipping contracts and money so quiet you could only hear it in the thickness of the carpets. Every June, for one single night, the iron gates of Hartwell Hall opened for the Lockhart Heritage Gala. 300 guests. A charity auction. United States senators flew down for it. A man who had taken a software company public in the spring arrived in a helicopter and parked it on the south lawn like a child setting down a toy. Old families from Charleston and Savannah and Beaufort put on jewelry that lived in a vault 364 days of the year and wore it for the one night they could be seen wearing it. People angled for that invitation the way other people angle for a transplant. And this year, every single one of them had come for a reason that had almost nothing to do with charity. They had come to hear a dead man's engine sing one last time. Cornelius Lockhart had built his fortune moving cargo across oceans, but he had spent his heart on machines. His collection of automobiles was famous on 3 continents, written about in magazines, printed on paper as thick as a wedding invitation. And of everything that man ever owned, one car stood above the rest, the way a cathedral stands above the little town built around it. A 1962 Beaumont GTS, a factory prototype, one of one, never sold, never raced, never copied. So rare that men who had spent their whole lives around such things argued in print over whether it should ever be driven again or simply sealed behind glass like the bone of a saint. Cornelius had died 19 months ago, in his sleep, in a house with 40 rooms. And tonight his daughter was letting the crown jewel go. The plan was theater, pure and total. At 10 o'clock, beneath the great chandelier in the ballroom, the Beaumont would rise up on a slow turntable lit from below. Its 12-cylinder engine would be started one last time, in front of every camera in the room, before the auctioneer's hammer ever moved. A farewell, a goodbye sung in oil and fire, performed for the whole watching world. The estimate stood at $35 million. And the auction house running the sale, a firm called Aldridge and Crown, had let it be known in the right ears that the proper bidding war could send the price somewhere. No private automobile had ever gone, and not one of those 300 people who planned that beautiful goodbye knew the man who actually kept the estate alive. Solomon Hale had worked at Hartwell Hall for 3 years. He fixed the irrigation in the dry months and nursed the ancient marsh-side generator through every storm that came up the coast. He rewired the boathouse after the water took it the year before. He kept a whole fleet of 40-year-old garden machinery, breathing on parts he machined himself. Alone, on a small lathe in a tool shed that smelled of grease and cut grass and river mud. He did all of it quietly, in worn boots, and that faded gray uniform with his first name stitched over the heart in white thread. The laundry had washed down to almost nothing, and he had learned the one lesson that every quiet man in a gray uniform eventually learns. Whether he wants to or not, you become furniture. You become part of the building. Guests handed him their empty glasses without ever breaking conversation. The way a person sets a cup down on a side table without looking. The kitchen staff called for him when something broke and forgot his face. The second it was fixed, he had worked through 3 Christmases at that house and received exactly 0 cards with his name on them. Because to most of the people who walked through those gates, he did not have a name. He had a function. Adelaide Lockhart had spoken to him exactly 4 times in 3 years. He had counted, the way a person counts things that wound them in small amounts. And every one of those 4 times, her eyes had come to rest somewhere, just past his shoulder, on the middle distance, the way people stare at a lamppost while they wait for a light to change. She was not cruel the way some of them were cruel. She was something far more ordinary, and, in its own way, far heavier. She had simply never once needed to see him. In the world she had been raised inside, Brilliance arrived in a tailored suit and a foreign accent. Brilliance carried a leather portfolio, not a toolbox. Brilliance got profiled and photographed and flown in. Brilliance was white, and it was rich, and it most certainly did not come down to the marsh on Sunday mornings to clear the storm grates by hand so that her father's lawn would not flood. It was not that she looked at Solomon Hale and saw a black man and decided he was worth less. It was worse than that, and quieter, She did not look at him at all. And a thing you refuse to look at, you never have to wonder about. So she never wondered. On the night of the gala, the estate glowed like a stage built for gods. Light traced every hedge and dripped from every oak. A jazz quartet played low and easy on the terrace, the kind of music meant to be heard without ever being listened to. Waiters in white moved through the crowd, carrying champagne and chilled oysters and crab claws on beds of crushed ice. And the warm air off the marsh carried salt and cut roses, and underneath it all, the faint, sweet smell of a very great deal of money gathered in one place. In the center of the ballroom, under a cover of gray silk, on a turntable ringed with hidden light. The Beaumont waited like an altar before a mass. Grayson Pell ran the evening with a clipboard, a headset, and a smile that had been built somewhere far away from his eyes. The estate manager was 60, silver-haired, smooth and cold as river ice in February, and he had perfected the single most useful skill of his profession. He could flatter a senator and gut a busboy in the same breath, without once changing his expression. For 4 months he had coordinated the sale with Aldridge and Crown, and every minute of this night sat printed on the schedule, clipped to his board. He had found Solomon that afternoon, by the tool shed, and delivered one instruction twice. Slowly, the way a man explains a thing to a child or a dog. Stay away from the ballroom. Pell had said, check the dock lights at 9. Watch the generator, and then make yourself scarce. Tonight is for a certain kind of guest. Solomon. He had let the name sit on his tongue, like it cost him something to use it. We have an image to keep. You understand me. You are a good worker. But you are not part of the picture tonight. So keep out of the picture. Solomon had looked at him for a long moment. The marsh wind moved the moss in the oaks behind the manager's head. Yes, sir, he had said. I will keep to the edges. And he had meant it. He was on a ladder behind the terrace at 20 minutes to 10, adjusting a flood lamp that had drifted off the magnolias, when the entire beautiful schedule began, very quietly. To die, to understand why a man in a faded gray uniform could hear $35 million and know in 4 seconds what 2 certified specialists could not find in 30 minutes. You have to understand where his hands came from. You have to go back to a brick house on the west side of Gary, Indiana, and a man named Amos Hale. Amos was Solomon's grandfather, and he was, by the account of every person who ever stood near his workbench, one of the greatest engine men of his entire generation. He could listen to a motor the way a doctor listens to a chest. He could lay his open palm flat on a running block and tell you, with his eyes shut, which cylinder was lying to him. In the 1950s and 60s, when the great racing teams came through the Midwest, they came to Amos Hale quietly, through the back, where no photographer would catch them, because Amos could find the half a horsepower that the white men in the engineering departments could not, and Amos charged less. And Amos, being a black man in Gary, Indiana, could never, ever be given the credit. He built engines that won. The trophies went up on shelves in offices he was not allowed to sit down in. The records he set with his own 2 hands were entered into history under other men's names. And Amos Hale, who could have run any engine shop in the country, died at 61, with grease still under his nails, having never once in his working life held a business card that said what he truly was. He left his grandson 3 things: a steel toolbox worn smooth at the handle, a battered engine dipstick he used to hold up to the light to read the way other men read scripture, and a small tin of peppermint candies that he kept in his shirt pocket and handed out, 1 each, every single time a boy got an answer right. An engine, Amos used to say, with the dipstick raised and the oil shining gold on the steel, does not care what your hands look like. It does not care what part of town you come from, or what they think of you down at the bank. An engine only knows two things: son, whether you understand it, and whether you do not. That is the only fair judge you will ever meet in this whole crooked world. Be good enough that the machine cannot lie about you. And one day the machine will tell the truth, even when the people will not. Solomon believed him. Solomon was the best student that great unknown man ever had. And Solomon did the thing his grandfather never got the chance to do. He went to school for it, earned the degree, walked through the front door of the industry with a diploma in his hand. And by his early 30s, he was the lead engine engineer for Kestrel Racing, building 12-cylinder endurance motors that finished races other teams did not survive. He was, for about 4 years, exactly what his grandfather had told him he could be. He was good enough that the machine could not lie about him. And then came the 12 hours of Greenbrier. Solomon's engine was leading by 2 full laps in the 9th hour when it let go. Catastrophically, on the front straight, in a cloud of smoke and torn metal, in front of 100,000 people and every camera at the track, no one was killed. By the grace of God and a good wall of barriers. But the car was destroyed. The championship was lost. The sponsor walked away, and the team needed a body to lay the blame on before the sun came up. And they had one ready. The inquiry that followed took 4 days. Solomon sat in a paneled room across a long table from men who had smiled at him at the Christmas party 4 months earlier. And he watched them decide, with a kind of relief that turned his stomach, that the failure had been an error in the engine specification. His specification, the crew chief, a 30-year man named Dale Furman, swore on his record and his gray hair that he had followed Solomon's numbers exactly. The board believed him. Of course they believed him. Dale Furman looked like the picture in their heads of a man who tells the truth. And Solomon Hale looked like the picture in their heads of a man who makes a mistake and then makes excuses. There was a folder, Solomon's own build folder, and he begged them to open it, because inside it were the original spec sheets in his own handwriting. And the numbers in that folder were not the numbers that had been inside the engine when it failed. Someone had altered the tolerances after he signed off. He knew it the way he knew his own name. They never opened the folder. They did not need to. They had already decided what he was before he ever sat down. The Greenbrier inquiry ruled the failure attributable to engineer Solomon Hale. 11 words went out on the wire. His name went onto a list that the small, tight world of racing keeps and never erases. No team would touch him. The phone stopped ringing, and the thing that broke him was not the unemployment, because he could turn a wrench anywhere. The thing that broke him was that his grandfather had been wrong about the one thing Solomon had built his whole life on. The machine had lied about him. Or rather, men had reached inside the machine and made it lie. And then they pointed at the lie and called it him. He kept the folder, unopened, sealed, exactly as it was the day they refused to look at it. He carried it from city to city for years, the way you carry a stone in your chest. And somewhere in those years, his marriage ended and his pride emptied out and his great gift went to sleep. And a man who had once built engines that beat the world ended up an hour south of Charleston, on a sea island, clearing storm grates by hand for a family that did not know his name. Because the work was honest and the marsh was quiet, and nobody out there had ever heard of Greenbrier. He had told himself he was done. He had told himself that the part of him that woke up at the sound of a hungry engine was dead and buried with his grandfather and his good name. And then, on a June night, through an open service door, a $35 million machine cried out for help in a language Only he and the dead man who taught him could speak. At 9:25, 35 minutes before the hammer was due, two factory men from the Beaumont Heritage Division lifted the gray silk for a final systems check. The starting ritual was meant to be a formality, and nothing more. The car had been fully serviced 9 days earlier. Fresh fluids. Every line inspected. A certified report signed and stamped and filed with the insurance underwriters, who do not accept the word probably about objects worth $35 million. The lead specialist lowered himself into the seat the way a priest lowers himself before the altar. He breathed once. Slowly, set his hand on the key, and turned it. The engine cranked. It caught, for half a heartbeat, a single cough of life, and then it died. He tried again. Crank. Cough. Silence. The second man frowned and started down the list of obvious sins. Battery. Strong. Spark. Present. Blue and fat at the plug. Fuel gauge. Reading full. They pulled a plug to look at it and found it bone dry. Not flooded. Not fouled. Dry as chalk. Which made no sense at all. Because the tank was full, and every fuel line in the car had been certified 9 days before by men who would lose their careers if they had lied. For most of half an hour, two of the best-trained engine men in the vintage world took turns failing in front of one another. While the most valuable automobile either of them would ever touch in their lives sat on a lit turntable, silent as a sealed tomb. Panic in a place like Hartwell Hall does not shout. It cannot afford to. It whispers. And it travels through the service corridors the way smoke travels under a door. Fast and low and impossible to call back. A waiter heard it from a porter. A bartender heard it from the waiter. A girl refilling water glasses heard it from the bartender. And by the time it reached Adelaide Lockhart, she was in the middle of laughing at something a federal judge's wife had said. And the laugh died on her mouth like a candle pinched between two fingers. She excused herself. She crossed the ballroom in 4-inch heels with her spine very straight and her face arranged into the careful nothing that money teaches its children. And she went backstage, behind the great velvet curtain, and she heard her own staff whispering the one sentence that no host of a $35 million evening should ever hear. Whatever you do not tell her the car is dead. She heard it anyway. And here is the thing the whispering men did not understand. Her panic was not really about the money. $35 million was a number. And her family had a great many numbers. The start, the song, the engine singing one final time under the chandelier. That was the heart of the entire night. That was the promise. She had stood up at this same gala the year before. In black. With her father 19 days in the ground. And she had told 300 people and a row of cameras that she would let the world hear her father's masterpiece breathe one last time before she let it go. 300 witnesses stood out there right now with their phones half raised and their smiles half built. Half of them praying for a triumph they could say they had seen. And the other half, the quieter half, already a little hungry for a disaster they could describe at brunch for the rest of the summer, if the Beaumont stayed silent. The headline in the morning would not say one word about charity. It would say that Cornelius Lockhart's daughter could not keep her father's legacy running for even 19 months. In her world, that single sentence was a kind of death. A death you kept living inside afterward. At every lunch and every gala. For the rest of your life, that was when Grayson Pell appeared at her elbow with a solution already polished to a shine. Cancel the start, he murmured. Low and warm and close to her ear. Announce a static auction. We will blame the salt air. The humidity off the marsh. The age of the seals. An act of God. We control the story. We keep the evening moving. We keep the champagne flowing. And the hammer still falls. Adelaide. Listen to me. Collectors do not buy noise. They buy history. A car like this does not need to make a single sound to sell for everything it is worth. Let it be a beautiful, silent, perfect thing. Let me make the announcement. I will be gentle. I have already thought of the words. It was reasonable. It was calm. It was kind. Avon. In the way a man is kind when he is leading you exactly where he already decided you would go. And it came just a little too quickly. Just a little too smooth. Like a man reading lines he had practiced in a mirror until they sounded spontaneous. But Adelaide was far too frightened to hear the rehearsal in it. And the 300 guests were far too rich to care which way it broke. The only person at Hartwell Hall who would ever have heard the wrongness in that speech, the only person whose ear was trained, by a lifetime of grief, to know the exact shape of a lie, wearing the costume of help, was walking past the open service door 60 feet away with a ladder on his shoulder. Solomon Hale heard the engine through that door before he heard anything else. Crank. Cough. Silence. He stopped walking. He stood very still in the dark on the gravel path. The ladder balanced on his shoulder, the party glittering through the windows above him. And he listened the way other men remember a face, because he had heard that exact rhythm before, that precise sequence of effort and failure, and not in a book and not in a class. He had heard it years ago, in another life, in a garage that smelled of high octane and fear, on a machine whose silence had cost him everything he had ever loved and the one name he had ever been proud to carry. He set the ladder down against the wall, slow and quiet, and he closed his eyes. And underneath the jazz and the laughter and the clink of 300 glasses, he let the machine tell him the truth. That sound did not say bad battery. It did not say flooded, or fouled, or act of God. That sound said fuel starvation, hungry cylinders, a heart with no blood reaching it, a tank full of gasoline that could not get to where it was needed, because somewhere between the tank and the engine, something that should be open had been closed, and Solomon Hale, who had spent 3 years learning to be furniture, stood in the dark and felt something he had not let himself feel in a very long time. He felt his hands wake up. He should have stayed outside. He knew it, even as he set the ladder down. Grayson Pell had told him to keep out of the picture. And 3 years of being furniture had taught him exactly what happened to a black man in a gray uniform who walked uninvited into a room full of the kind of people who summered at Hartwell Hall. Nothing good. Nothing he wanted. But there are some sounds a man cannot unhear. And there are some debts. To a grandfather. To the truth. To the boy he used to be. That come due at the strangest hours. He walked in through the service entrance. Down the corridor. Past the velvet curtain. And out into the light of the ballroom. And the temperature of the room changed around him, the way water changes when something walks into it. Heads turned. Conversations did not stop. Exactly. But they thinned. A woman in emerald green stepped back half a pace and put one hand near her clutch without quite knowing she had done it. A waiter froze with a tray of oysters and shot a look at Pell that said, "Do you want me to do something about this?" And in the cleared center of the room, beside the silent car, Grayson Pell turned, saw the gray uniform crossing his beautiful marble floor, and his polished face did something it almost never did. It curdled. Solomon walked to the open hood, set down his toolbox, and lifted out a heavy iron wrench, already speaking, calm and even and low. The car is not flooded, and it is not the battery. he said. It is fuel starvation. You have got gas in the tank that is not reaching the cylinders. I can hear it. Give me a few minutes, and I can fix it. And that was when Grayson Pell crossed the floor and slapped him. The crack of it rang out across the marble. Solomon's head snapped sideways, the sting flaring hot across his cheek. But he did not stumble, and he did not raise a hand, and he did not raise his voice. Not then, and not once, that entire night. And that, more than anything, was what unsettled them. Pell tore the iron wrench out of his grip and hurled it to the ground, where it clattered and skidded away across the stone. Keep your filthy, grease-stained hands off a masterpiece. Boy, Pell hissed, wiping his palm on a napkin with open disgust, as though he had touched something diseased. Look at your skin. Look at that faded gray rag they call a uniform. A high society gala is no place for a blackyard man who smells like river mud and poverty. You are nothing but furniture in this house. Go crawl back to the marsh and clear the storm drains where you belong. The words landed in the room like a thrown drink. And for one ugly second, the room loved it, because the people of Hartwell Hall had been waiting all night for permission to feel superior to something. And here, at last, walking right up to the altar in work boots, was a thing they were certain they could feel superior to. A man near the front laughed out loud. A tall, pink, well-fed man named Whit Carrington, who had been to the right schools and inherited the right firm, and had never once in his life been told no by anyone who could not be fired for it. "Oh, this is marvelous," Carrington said, loud enough to carry, turning to share it with the people behind him. "The yard man is going to save the auction. Somebody get the cameras. No, do not. You will hurt the resale value." He looked Solomon up and down. "Slow. The way you would appraise a horse you had no intention of buying. You know what that car is. Friend, that engine has more value than your entire situation. Walk it back to the shed. There is a good fellow." The laughter spread. It was not all of them. It was never all of them. But it was enough. Enough that it filled the room. Enough that the people who did not laugh looked down at their shoes and said nothing. Which is its own kind of laughter. The quietest and the most common kind. The kind that lets the cruelty know it is safe. Somewhere a phone came up. Then 10 phones. Then 30. And the little red lights began to glow. And 300 people settled in to watch a man be put back in his place. And then Adelaide Lockhart made the mistake that 40 million people would one day watch her make. She was frightened. And she was cornered. And the static auction speech was sitting in her mouth. And some cold part of her wanted, just for one moment, to be the one holding the whip instead of the one under it. So she let out a harsh, mocking laugh, the diamonds at her throat throwing the chandelier light around the room like broken glass. And she turned to face her audience, and her smile sharpened into something close to pure cruelty. And she said it. "You know what?" she said. "Fix it, and I will marry you." The room roared. It was the funniest thing any of them had heard all year. The heiress promising her hand to the yard man. The queen and the beggar. In the joke so old, it was carved into the marble of that house in the year 1851. Whit Carrington nearly fell into the woman beside him. Champagne went down the wrong way somewhere, and somebody had to be slapped on the back. The jazz quartet, who could not see what was happening, kept playing something soft and bright. And the cruelty of the room laid itself down on top of that pretty music like oil, spreading over clean water, and Solomon Hale stood in the middle of all of it, his cheek still burning, in his grandfather's boots. And he did not flinch. He had been laughed at by experts, He had been laughed at by a paneled board with his unopened folder 6 inches from their hands. This was nothing. This was children. He waited. He let the laughter run itself out. The way you let an engine idle down before you cut it. And when it had thinned to a few last giggles and the room was watching to see whether he would run, or be, or shout, he bent down, picked the iron wrench up off the floor where Pell had thrown it, and wiped it clean on his rag. Then he looked at Adelaide Lockhart, and he said the only thing he said before he went to work, "I will hold you to the part where you stop and watch." Then he turned his back on 300 of the richest people in the American South, knelt down beside the dead Beaumont, and got to work. The first thing he did was the thing none of the specialists had done, and the thing that told you everything about the difference between a man with a certificate and a man with a calling. He did not touch the engine. He listened to the building. He laid one flat palm on the lower body panel near the fuel cell, the way Amos used to lay a hand on a block, and he closed his eyes. And he was very still for long enough that the room grew uncomfortable with the stillness. Then he opened his eyes and asked the lead specialist one quiet question. "When you pulled the plug and found it dry, did you crack the line at the pump and check for flow? Or did you just check that the tank was full?" The specialist opened his mouth, closed it, said, "The tank read full. The certification, the tank is full." Solomon said, "I am not asking about the tank. I am asking if the fuel is moving." He did not wait for the answer, because he already had it. He slid himself under the front of the car. Gray uniform against the black marble. 300 people, staring at the soles of a working man's boots. And he found, in about 90 seconds, the thing that 30 minutes of certified expertise had walked right past. There was an inline fuel shutoff valve. An old brass thing, original to the car, tucked up behind a crossmember where the factory had hidden it 60 years ago, and where nobody in the modern world ever thought to look, because modern cars do not have them in that spot. It was a manual valve, a simple quarter turn. Open. The fuel flowed. Closed. The engine starved. Exactly the way a starving engine had cried out to him through the service door. It was closed. And here is where Solomon's hands went still again. Just for a second. Because the brass tells a story if you know how to read it. And this brass was telling him something that made the back of his neck go cold. A valve like that, 60 years old. Untouched. When you close it, you fight a lifetime of varnish and corrosion. And the brass scars. It galls. It leaves a record. This valve was clean and recently turned. The witness marks were fresh. Somebody had been under this car. Within the last week or two, with a clean tool and a steady hand, and had quietly closed the one valve in the entire fuel system that no factory specialist on earth would think to check. In the one car in the world where a silent engine could be worth tens of millions to exactly the right kind of buyer, this car had not failed. This car had been murdered. Solomon lay there on the cold marble for one extra breath, holding that knowledge, and he understood several things at once. He understood why the estate manager had a polished speech ready 3 minutes after a 30-year certified car mysteriously died. He understood why that speech was so smooth, so rehearsed, so quick to land on the word static auction. And he understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had once been the body laid on the altar, that he was lying underneath someone else's crime, and that if he kept his mouth shut and crawled back to the shed the way he had been told to, the crime would work perfectly, and a beautiful dead car would sell cheap to exactly the man it was meant to sell cheap to, and no one would ever know. He could have crawled out and pointed at Pell and started a war right there on the marble. He did not. Not yet. Because his grandfather had taught him one more thing. In that garage in Gary. The most important thing of all, do not argue with the people. Some? Make the machines speak. People can be lied to. People want to be lied to. But an engine running clean and true in a quiet room, that is a witness nobody can cross-examine. Fix it first. Let it sing. Then let them try to call you a liar over the top of the music. So he reached up, and he found the little brass valve, and he turned it. Open. He felt the click of it travel up through his fingers and into his arm, like a key turning in a lock he had been standing outside of for years. Then he slid out from under the car, stood up, wiped his hands on the rag from his back pocket, and walked to the open driver's door. It needs to clear the lines, he said. To no one and everyone. Give it a few seconds to remember what it is. The room had gone quiet. Somewhere in the last 10 minutes, the laughter had drained out of it. Because there is something about watching a man work, really work, with certainty and reverence, and no wasted motion. That shames a laughing room into silence, whether it understands what it is watching or not. Whit Carrington was not smiling anymore. Grayson Pell had gone the gray of old paper, and was standing very, very still, near the edge of the turntable. His hand half lifted, as if he wanted to stop what was about to happen, and could not think of a single reason he was allowed to give. Solomon Hale sat down in the seat of a $35 million machine in his faded gray uniform. He put his left hand on the wheel. He set his right hand on the key. The same gesture the priest-faced specialist had made 40 minutes earlier, except that where the specialist had hoped. Solomon knew, he thought, just for a moment, of Emma's, of the dipstick raised to the light, of the tin of peppermints. The machine cannot lie about you. So, be good enough. And one day it will tell the truth, even when the people will not. He turned the key. The Beaumont's 12 cylinders caught fuel for the first time in 35 minutes. Caught it and held it and drank. And the engine did not cough, did not stumble, did not so much as hesitate. It came alive all at once. A deep, clean, world-shaking roar that climbed up out of 60 years of silence and filled that ballroom from the marble floor to the chandelier and rattled the crystal on 300 raised glasses. And then it settled, smooth as oil over glass, into the steadiest idle anyone in that room had ever heard. A sound like a great cat purring in the dark. A sound like a dead man's heart beginning to beat again. The song they had been promised, for one full second. Nobody in the room breathed. And then one of the factory specialists, the priest-faced one, who knew better than any other person alive exactly what he had just watched a man in safety boots accomplish, said into the stunned and ringing quiet, in a voice cracked open with something close to awe, "May God, listen to it. It is perfect. Here is where the story turns. And here is where the dead man kept his promise. Because there was someone in that ballroom that night who actually knew what he had just seen. Not a senator. Not a software man in a helicopter. Not Whit Carrington with his inherited firm. An Oatman. He had been standing near the back the whole night. Leaning on a cane he did not strictly need. Watching the gala the way a retired general watches a parade. With affection and a little contempt and a very, very sharp eye. His name was Thaddeus Crane. If you knew automobiles, really knew them, down in the marrow, you knew that name the way a painter knows Rembrandt. Thaddeus Crane had built the most respected restoration house in North America, a firm called Crane Heritage Works, where the great cars of the world went to be made whole again by the last true masters of the craft. He had forgotten more about 12-cylinder engines than the entire Beaumont Heritage Division would ever know. He had come tonight to watch the prototype sell, and to mourn, privately, the passing of one more great machine into the hands of a man who would only seal it behind glass. And Thaddeus Crane had heard that engine die through the service door an hour ago, exactly the way Solomon had heard it. And he had stood at the back, saying nothing, while two certified specialists failed and failed and failed. Because he was 81 years old and tired, and it was not his car and not his problem, and the world had stopped listening to old men years ago. He had watched the heiress get cornered. He had watched the manager produce his suspiciously polished speech. He had watched the handyman walk in. And he had watched the estate manager slap him across the face. And he had watched the room laugh. And he had watched the woman throw a wedding like a coin at a beggar. And through all of it, Thaddeus Crane had not moved. Because he was waiting. He was a man who had spent 60 years learning that talk was nothing and proof was everything. And he was waiting to see whether the handyman could make the machine speak. The handyman made the machine speak. And the second that engine settled into its impossible, perfect idle, Thaddeus Crane started walking. He came up through the crowd, parting it with his cane and his name, and the sheer force of a man who has nothing left to lose and no patience left to lose it with. And he walked straight past Grayson Pell, straight past Adelaide Lockhart, straight up to the open driver's door of the Beaumont, where Solomon Hale was just lifting his hand off the key. "Son," Crane said, and his old voice, when it came, was loud enough to carry over the idling engine and clear to the back of the room, because he wanted every soul in that ballroom to hear it. "Son, where did you learn to find a closed valve by sound?" Solomon looked up at him. Two engine men, eyes meeting across the open door of a singing machine, and something passed between them in that look that the rest of the room would never fully understand. The recognition of one true craftsman by another, across every line the world had ever built between them. "My grandfather," Solomon said simply. "Amos Hale. Gary. Indiana." The old man went absolutely rigid. "Amos Hale," Thaddeus Crane repeated, and his voice dropped, and his free hand came up and pressed flat against his own chest. "I knew Amos Hale. I bought engines from Amos Hale. In 1968. Through the back of a garage. Because the front of my own company would not let me put his name on a single invoice. And I have been ashamed of that for 57 years. He looked at Solomon's face, like he was reading a map of a country he had thought was lost forever. "You have got his hands. I watched you lay your palm on that body panel, and I knew it before you said a word." Then he turned. Slowly, deliberately, a master pivoting to address his own field, and he raised his voice to the entire ballroom. And what he said next went out of 300 phones and into the bloodstream of the internet and was, within a week, the most watched 60 seconds anyone associated with Hartwell Hall would ever be part of. "You laughed at this man," Thaddeus Crane said, the engine purring under his words. "I watched you do it. I watched a man in this room strike him across the face. You looked at the uniform and the boots and the color of his skin, and you decided what he was. And you laughed. And one of you offered him a wedding as a joke. So let me introduce you to the man you were laughing at. Since not one of you bothered to ask his name." He set his cane down with a crack that echoed, "This is Solomon Hale. His grandfather built more winning engines than any man of his generation, and was never once allowed to sign his own work. And this man in the gray uniform you summered past without seeing, I know exactly who he is, because I followed his case for years, and I have wanted to find him for a very long time. This is the engineer, the Greenbrier inquiry, destroyed, the one they blamed for a failure that was never his, the smartest hands in American motorsport, and you had him clearing your storm drains." He turned back to Solomon. The whole room was dead silent now, except for the engine. The dead man's engine, singing on and on like a witness who could not be made to stop telling the truth. "They buried you." "So?" Thaddeus Crane said. Quieter now. Just to him, though every phone in the room caught it. "I read that file 20 years ago, and I knew the numbers never added up. And braver men than me stayed quiet. And I stayed quiet too. And I have carried that, and tonight I walked in to watch one more great machine go silent forever. And instead I watched a man they buried dig himself up out of the ground with his bare hands. In front of everyone who put him there, Solomon Hale, who had not flinched at the slap, who had not flinched at the laughter, who had not flinched at the wedding, who had not flinched at any of it. I had to look away for just a moment. Because the one thing in this world that could still get inside his armor was an old man saying out loud the thing he had needed someone to say for 20 years. The numbers never added up. It was not your fault. The machine did not lie. They made it lie. He did not trust his voice. So he did what his grandfather would have done. He just reached out and shook the old man's offered hand. Hard. Once. The handshake of one craftsman to another, and the room watched the head of the most respected restoration house in North America grip the hand of the yard man like they were equals. Because they always had been, and the only people who had not known it were the ones holding the phones. After that, the night turned into something that none of them could control, and the justice came in, the way arithmetic always comes in, late but exact. The auction itself went off the rails in the most beautiful way. When the hammer finally came up an hour later, the Beaumont was no longer just a car. It was the car, the one from the video, the prototype that had been quietly murdered and then resurrected on a turntable in front of the world by a man the room had slapped and laughed at. The bidding was savage. It blew past 35, past 40, past 45. And when the dust settled, the hammer fell at $52 million. The most ever paid for an automobile, at a public sale, and the winning bidder, the soft-spoken software man who had parked the helicopter on the lawn, stood up and did something the auction house had never in its history seen anyone do. He made his purchase conditional and ominous. He would sign nothing, he announced into the microphone, until the gentleman in the gray uniform personally signed the car's technical dossier, the formal provenance document that travels with a great machine forever. He wanted the history of this night recorded properly. He wanted the right name in the file. 100 years from now, the software man said, somebody is going to own this car. And they are going to read the history. And they are going to read that on the night it sold, it was dead. And a man named Solomon Hale brought it back to life. I want that written down. I want his name on it. That is my condition. So Solomon Hale, 3 hours removed from adjusting a flood lamp on a magnolia, sat down at a small table beside a $52 million automobile and signed the provenance documents of the most expensive car ever sold, in his own hand, while 300 of the richest people in the American South stood up and applauded him, some of them out of awe, and some of them, the honest among them, out of shame, which is sometimes how applause begins to be earned back. Thaddeus Crane was waiting when he set down the pen. The old man did not do small talk. He offered Solomon the position of Director of Engine Restoration at Crane Heritage Works, on the spot, in front of witnesses, at a salary that made the number Hartwell Hall had been paying him sound like a joke. And then he lowered his voice, though not so low that the nearest cameras missed it. And he said one more thing. I still have the contacts. Crane said, and I still have the file from your inquiry I requested it years ago, and I never threw it away. There are two motorsport journalists I trust, with long memories and even longer teeth. With your permission, son, I would like to mail them everything tomorrow morning, including that folder you have been carrying, because I think it is time the machine told the truth out loud. And I think it is long past time the people had to listen. Solomon Hale, who had carried a sealed folder for 20 years, like a stone in his chest, looked at the old man for a long moment. "It is in my truck," he said. "I never could throw it away either." And then the crowd parted again. Because Adelaide Lockhart was walking toward the turntable, she had taken off her heels. Nobody saw her do it. But somewhere in the last hour, the 4-inch heels had come off. And she crossed the marble barefoot. Small. For the first time in her life, small. In her own ballroom. In front of her own guests. She stopped in front of the man she had laughed at and thrown a wedding at 60 minutes earlier. And the whole room held its champagne and waited to see what an heiress says to a man after the world has watched her get it that wrong. "Mr. Hale," she said. 2 words. His name. And a door opening that she had kept locked for 3 years. She had never once used it. She had handed him a dozen glasses and never once said, "Mr. Hale." And now she stood there barefoot on the marble of a house her family had scrubbed an old story off of. And she did the thing the rich are worst at. The thing that costs them more than money. She let 300 people watch her be wrong. "I have spent 3 years walking past you," she said. And her voice was not steady. And she let it not be steady. "I handed you my empty glass. An hour ago, I let my own estate manager strike you across the face in my house. And then I offered you a wedding because I thought it was funny. Because I thought you were a thing I could be funny about. And you fixed my father's car. You gave me back the one thing I promised the world and could not deliver. And you did it after all of that. I do not know how a person repays such a thing. I suppose I owe you a ring." And the room laughed. One more time. But differently now. Nervous and uncertain. No one sure anymore who was allowed to laugh at what. The old cruelty trying to put its clothes back on and finding they no longer fit. Solomon Hale reached down and closed his toolbox before he answered. The 2 latches snapped shut. And in the silence of that ballroom, the sound carried like a gavel coming down. "You do not owe me a wedding." "Ma'am," he said. He stood, and he picked up the box. And he looked at her. Not past her shoulder. Not at the safe middle distance. But at her. The way she had never once looked at him. "You owe yourself a better way of seeing people. That is all. That is the whole bill." He paused. "My grandfather kept this family's kind of houses running for 40 years and never once got a card with his name on it either. So when you go to repay your debt, and I think that you will, do not pay it to me. Pay it to the next man you are about to walk past." No applause followed that. Something quieter happened instead. 300 people looked down at their shoes. And a barefoot heiress nodded. Slowly. Once. Like a student receiving a grade, she knew she had earned and would never be able to argue. Within a day. That sentence was a caption on the internet. Within a week, it was printed on shirts. The Lockhart family never authorized, and, to Adelaide's credit, never once tried to fight. The rest of the reckoning arrived on schedule. Because arithmetic always does. Aldridge and Crown froze the Beaumont service file before midnight. Partly on Solomon's word about the fresh witness marks on a valve that should have been 60 years untouched. And partly because the head of Crane Heritage Works himself had crawled under that car with a flashlight, looked at the brass, and gone very quiet. The auction house investigators worked backward through the service invoices over the following week, and they found what saboteurs always leave behind: A money trail dressed up as paperwork. Grayson Pell had quietly steered the Beaumont certified service 9 days earlier to an unlicensed shop owned by an old friend, pocketing the difference between what the estate paid and what the work actually cost. That alone was theft. But then he had gone one step into the dark. Phone records pulled by the investigators showed that a private collector, a man named Vesper, who had wanted the prototype for a decade and been told every single time that it would never sell, had offered Pell a substantial private commission if the car came to market broken, unstartable, cheap, a beautiful dead thing that the smart money could carry away quietly while the world looked the other way. And the static auction speech, the smooth, rehearsed, suspiciously ready speech that Pell had murmured in Adelaide's ear 3 minutes after the engine died, turned out to have been drafted 3 full days before the engine ever failed. They found the document, they found the dates. He had planned to bury Solomon under his crime, the exact same way other men had once buried Solomon under theirs. The only thing he had not planned for was a man who could hear the truth through an open door, and an old man at the back of the room who had spent his whole life learning that proof outlives a lie. And there was one more thing Grayson Pell had not planned for. 300 phones had recorded him crossing a marble floor to strike an unarmed working man across the face, in front of witnesses, in high definition, from a dozen angles. The video did not just expose a saboteur. It documented an assault. So when Pell was escorted off the estate at 1 o'clock in the morning, his clipboard left behind on a banquet table where someone eventually threw it in the trash with the empty oyster shells. He was walking out into far more than the end of a job. The auction house filed for fraud. The insurance underwriters filed for everything else. And a prosecutor, looking at 40 million views of a clean and undeniable battery, filed criminal charges of his own. By the end of the month, every estate and auction firm and great family on the eastern seaboard had quietly closed its doors to him. And the man who once stood in a beautiful ballroom and decided who was and was not part of the picture was explaining himself to investigators in a borrowed suit. Having become at last exactly the kind of person he had spent his whole career looking down on, the video did its own work. The way these things do now, 40 million views in a week. Cut and recut. Captioned in a dozen languages. The first half showed a ballroom of the powerful slapping and laughing at a man in a uniform, and an heiress throwing him a wedding like a coin. The second half showed his hands. The palm on the panel. The boots sliding under the car. The brass valve. The key. The resurrection. The old master crossing the room to grip his hand. Nobody needed a narrator to explain the lesson. And for once, the internet aimed its enormous anger at the right targets. While underneath, in the comments, hundreds of thousands of people who had spent their own lives being treated like furniture told their own stories of the day they were finally seen. The nurse, the janitor, the line cook, the mechanic, the immigrant grandmother, the man who quietly fixed everyone's problems and whose name no one ever knew. But the part of the reckoning that mattered most to Solomon Hale was the part that came in from 20 years away. Thaddeus Crane mailed the sealed folder, exactly as promised, to the 2 journalists with long memories. They found the altered specifications inside 3 weeks, exactly where Solomon's unopened folder had always said they would be. The original numbers in his own handwriting, sitting right beside the doctored ones that had killed his career. Confronted, the crew chief, dharmann, who had sworn on his 30 years and his gray hair, confessed through a lawyer, and the sanctioning body that had ruled against Solomon 2 decades earlier issued a formal correction, 5 years late. Then 20, 11 words long, the same length as the 11 words that had buried him. The failure was not attributable to engineer Solomon Hale. Amos Hale never lived to read it. The man who taught Solomon everything, who handed out peppermints for right answers and held a dipstick up to the light like scripture and promised his grandson that the machine would tell the truth even when the people would not. Amos had been gone for years. So Solomon did the only thing left to do. He had the correction framed, and he hung it on the wall of his new office at Crane Heritage Works, right beside a single old photograph, a black man in a Gary, Indiana garage in 1965, holding a dipstick up to the light, grinning at something just off camera, having just gotten an answer right. The machine had told the truth, at last. It had only taken the world 57 years to listen. 1 year later, the roller doors of Crane Heritage Works stood open on a bright spring morning, and 12 kids, in brand new coveralls, stood in a half circle around an open engine bay. They were the first class of the Amos Hale Scholarship. Adelaide Lockhart had funded it. She had stood in front of the cameras 3 days after the gala, with no stylist and no script, and her hair pulled back plain, and she had called her own behavior by its right name. All of it. The 3 years of not seeing, the slap she allowed in her house, the wedding she threw like a coin. And then she had done the only thing money can honestly do about a thing like that. She endowed it fully, in perpetuity. A trade scholarship for kids who learn with their hands. The ones the world walks past. The ones who fix everyone's problems and never get a card with their name on it. She named it not after her family, and not after Solomon, but after a Gary, Indiana mechanic she had never met and would never meet. The Amos Hale Scholarship. And the first time Solomon read that name in the press release, he had to read it twice before he believed it. And then he had to sit down, and every color of hand was in that half circle that spring morning. Black kids and white kids and brown kids. A girl from a reservation 2 states away. A boy whose family had crossed an ocean. A kid from the same west side of Gary, where it had all begun. Solomon Hale, director of engine restoration now, in a clean uniform that had his last name on it this time, stitched in thread that had not yet faded, walked down the line of them, and at each kid he stopped, and he reached out, and he laid one oily palm gently over their eyes, one at a time. And he said the same thing his grandfather had said to him in a garage long ago. Do not look at it. Listen to it. Tell me what is wrong by sound alone. The machine does not care what your hands look like, or what part of town you came from, or what they think of you down at the bank. It only knows whether you understand it. Be good enough that it cannot lie about you. And one day, I promise you, it will tell the truth even when the people will not. And every kid who got the answer right got the same thing. A peppermint, out of a tin he kept in his shirt pocket, handed over one at a time. The way it had always been done, outside the open roller doors, in the spring sun. Satakar, not the Beaumont. That one was behind glass in Austin now. But another one. An old coupe that had come into the shop a wreck and gone out, finished at last. Its paint shining like a kept promise. And inside, 12 kids, the world had been getting ready to overlook, stood around an open engine and learned the only thing that had ever really mattered. An engine does not ask your name. It never did. It does not care about your uniform, or your boots, or the part of town you come from, or the color of the hands that reach inside it. It asks only one question, the fairest question you will ever be asked by anyone or anything in this whole crooked world. Do you understand me, or do you not? And if the answer is yes, it will sing for you, loud enough to fill a ballroom, loud enough to shake the crystal, loud enough that the people who spent years refusing to see you will have no choice at last but to hear. So let me ask you, the way that night asked all of them, if you had been standing in that ballroom, in the silk and the diamonds, with a phone in your hand, when a man in a uniform was slapped across the face and the room began to laugh, would you have laughed along with them? Would you have looked down at your shoes and said nothing, which is its own kind of laughing? Or would you have been the one person in 300 who stepped forward and said, "Let the man work. Tell me the truth down in the comments." Not the answer you wish were true, the real one. And tell me this too, because I truly want to know, who is the Amos Hale in your life? Who is the person with the smartest hands you have ever known? The one who never got the title, never got the card, never got their own name on their own work. Say their name in the comments. Say it out loud. Let us finally get it written down, where the world can read it. If this story moved you, share it with someone the world keeps walking past, and subscribe to The Silent Verdict, because the truth always cuts louder than the lie. An engine does not ask your name, but it is about time the rest of us started to.